Deep beneath the earth lies a darkness so absolute that it suffocates the mind. Humanity harbored one ultimate terror above all others, the fear of premature underground burial. Imagine waking up to complete silence in confined spaces. The air feels heavy and stale in your lungs. You reach out and your hands touch cold, solid wood. This terrifying realization was not a mere ghost story for our ancestors. It was a documented medical reality that swept across cities and towns during the Victorian era. Physicians during the 19th century possessed limited diagnostic tools. A deep coma or sudden cataleptic state could mimic death with shocking accuracy, fooling even the most experienced doctors. Rampant diseases like cholera complicated matters further by ravaging entire communities. Frightened citizens buried the dead quickly to prevent contagion, often skipping careful examinations of the unfortunate victims. When crowded graveyards were moved or tombs were reopened, the horrific truth was often revealed. Gravediggers discovered bodies twisted in unnatural positions, indicating desperate struggles beneath the earth. Fingernails were found embedded into the wooden lids of caskets. Shredded burial shrouds and desperate scratch marks painted a grim picture of those final moments in total darkness. One infamous account details the tragic fate of a young woman from England. After collapsing suddenly, her family mistakenly believed she had perished from a sudden heart failure. She was interred within the family vault rapidly. Days later, children playing near the crypt reported hearing faint cries echoing from the cold stones of the dark mausoleum. Authorities finally opened the heavy stone door and found the casket lid pushed aside. She had dragged herself toward the exit before suffocating on the stagnant crypt air. Stories like these ignited mass panic across civilized nations. People drafted detailed wills specifically demanding decapitation or a pierced heart before burial to ensure their actual final demise. Writers such as Edgar Allan Poe capitalized on this pervasive cultural anxiety. His gruesome tales of premature burial perfectly mirrored the genuine dread lingering in the public consciousness. But society sought practical solutions to quell these mounting fears. In Germany, municipalities constructed waiting mortuaries, where corpses were laid out under careful observation for several long days. Strings were tied to the fingers of the deceased. These strings connected to loud bells designed to ring loudly if the supposed corpse made even the slightest movement. Guards walked the quiet halls of these grim waiting buildings, listening for a sudden chime. However, decomposing bodies naturally shift, causing terrifying false alarms that startled the watchmen. Soon, inventors began designing intricate safety coffins for those who could afford peace of mind. Patents flooded the registries featuring air tubes, escape hatches, and complex alarm systems. One design incorporated a glass window positioned directly above the face. A pipe extended above the dirt, allowing fresh air to reach the trapped individual beneath the ground. Another inventor created a wooden vault equipped with a system of ropes. If pulled, the ropes released the lid and raised a flag high above the cemetery's soil. The phrase "saved by the bell" is often incorrectly attributed to these devices. However, the morbid fascination with ringing graveyard bells perfectly illustrates the deep paranoia of society. Despite these strange inventions, the terror of the grave remained a powerful force. Poverty meant that many ordinary citizens could never afford such luxurious and protective final arrangements. They were buried in simple pine boxes, covered under 6 feet of heavy soil. For them, there would be no warning bells and no breathing tubes for survival. Imagine the overwhelming psychological trauma of awakening within that tight wooden enclosure. Total sensory deprivation crashes over the mind as oxygen slowly depletes within the extremely narrow space. Panic inevitably sets in quickly. Your heartbeat accelerates, consuming the precious little air that remains. Every drawn breath feels hotter and substantially thinner than the last you took. You push upward, but the lid is completely immovable. Hundreds of pounds of compacted earth press relentlessly downward against the flimsy wooden boards sealing you in your tomb. Your fingers begin to claw desperately at the rough timber above. Splinters embed themselves deeply beneath your fingernails. But the sheer instinct to survive overrides all physical pain. Screams are muffled entirely by the thick layers of soil covering the grave. Up on the surface, the graveyard remains perfectly serene, with birds singing in the trees. It is this precise contrast that makes the ordeal so horrifying. While life continues normally above, one's soul struggles in absolute solitary agony just several feet below ground. Medical science eventually evolved to prevent these ghastly occurrences. The stethoscope was invented, allowing doctors to clearly detect a heartbeat even when it was incredibly weak and slow. Embalming practices also became standard protocol before a burial. The harsh chemical process ensured that no living person could ever accidentally be placed inside a sealed wooden casket. The invention of the safety coffin slowly faded into obscurity. These bizarre contraptions were relegated to the dusty pages of history and forgotten museums showcasing morbid antique oddities. Yet the chilling stories remain permanently etched into our cultural memory. We still instinctively shudder at the mere thought of being buried alive in a cold, dark box. Consider the story of Angelo Hayes, a young man who crashed his motorcycle. Doctors declared him deceased, and he was buried under the soil of a rural cemetery. Days later, insurance investigators demanded an exhumation regarding his specific policy. When they opened the coffin, they were shocked to discover that his body was still genuinely warm. Angelo had entered a deep coma to protect his brain from injury. He survived because his breathing was shallow enough to conserve the limited oxygen within the coffin. Such modern miracles are extremely rare, but they validate the ancient phobia. The line between life and death is sometimes thinner than the wooden boards of a casket. There is a primal reason we dread enclosed spaces and deep darkness. Our brains associate confinement directly with suffocation and the absolute finality of the cold, lonely grave. When investigating old cemeteries, researchers sometimes deploy ground-penetrating radar systems. These devices detect anomalies underground, revealing collapsed vaults and caskets that suffered strange stress from the inside. Are these anomalies just natural shifts in the settling earth below? Or do they represent the desperate thrashing of someone waking up realizing their horrific and tragic mistake? We may never know the true number of those buried prematurely. Records were poorly kept, and admitting such an error was devastating to the reputation of local physicians. Families wanted to believe their loved ones passed away peacefully asleep. The gruesome reality of scratched lids and bloodied fingers was a secret entirely too terrible to share. Think about the immense silence that fills a sealed coffin underground. It is a quiet so heavy that you can easily hear the rushing blood inside your veins. In that darkness, time loses all meaning and entirely ceases to exist. A few minutes of blind panic can stretch infinitely, feeling like an eternity of pure torture. Some historical texts claim victims lived for several days underground alone. The slow accumulation of carbon dioxide eventually brought a merciful end to their horrific subterranean physical struggles. Cemeteries are supposed to represent peaceful resting places for the departed. Yet beneath the beautifully carved headstones lies a terrifying history of immense suffering and profound human error. As we wander among the silent graves, we must respectfully wonder. How many voices cried out into the dirt only to be completely ignored by the world above? The horror of the premature burial remains the ultimate tragic nightmare. It forces us to confront our absolute helplessness against the dark, unknown void of eternal black death. Today we trust the monitor beeps and the cold clinical examinations. We depend heavily on advanced science to guarantee that the grave is truly ready for our arrival. But deeply ingrained fears are notoriously difficult to erase completely away. The old instinct remains alive, whispering to us when we step into a pitch-black, dark room. The scratch marks found inside those vintage coffins speak endless volumes. They are silent testaments to an unbelievable will to live, fighting against an utterly impossible, hopeless scenario. Each splintered board is a tragic monument to profound human despair. These victims were betrayed by the very people who loved them most and buried them too early. There is no greater solitary confinement than a securely nailed casket. It is a prison built exactly to the dimensions of the inmate, containing no promise of release. Those safety mechanisms with their fragile strings and little brass bells, they represent a touching yet pathetic attempt to control an incredibly vast and entirely unpredictable, terrifying fate. Imagine pulling the string, hoping someone hears the little chime ringing. You wait in absolute darkness, praying that the gravedigger is awake and listening for your desperate signal. But what if the bell mechanism had been jammed by dirt? What if a heavy rainstorm masked the ringing sound, entirely drowning out your one single fragile hope? These horrific questions tormented the minds of the 19th century public. It drove an entire generation to constantly rethink the exact process of determining final and true mortality. Modern doctors rely upon brain scans and extremely precise heart monitors. The terrifying guesswork of the past has been replaced by cold, reliable, and strictly definitive scientific data. Still, the visceral image of the scratched coffin lid remains powerful. It serves as a grim reminder of a time when medicine was imperfect and terrifyingly dangerously flawed. We close the vault door on this dark chapter of history, but we can never completely silence the phantom echoes of those who scratched desperately against solid wood. Their horrific final moments are safely locked away beneath the dirt. Yet their terrifying legacy continues to haunt the edges of our deep collective subconscious to this day. Sleep peacefully, knowing the earth above you is quiet and still. The dark horrors of the prematurely buried have finally been laid to their permanent, eternal, restful peace.